we talk a lot of, when we talk about conservative Christians, we typically think of Southern Baptists, white evangelicals, and the like. Can you talk about the role that conservative Catholics have in this movement, if it's any different than what we're seeing in the other types of churches?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. I mean, I think that the role of conservative Catholics is underappreciated. People often talk about this as a white evangelical movement, but it's not exclusively white. And it's not exclusively about evangelicals, even though white evangelicals did vote for Trump in extraordinarily large numbers. But the movement would be nowhere without a cadre of ultra-conservative Catholic leaders who have often, just look at the Supreme Court. Look at Leonard Leo, an ultra-conservative Catholic whose role as a money man for the religious right has really built up that right-wing legal ecosphere. On the conservative side, you have a lot of very vital thinkers of the movement who've provided a kind of intellectual infrastructure or scaffolding for aspects of the movement. Now, American Catholics are, of course, the jump ball of American politics. They sort of vote everywhere, divided nearly evenly, right to left or, center, whatever. But they, here's the thing. Within the Catholic hierarchy, there's been a real crisis in recent years. Like I would say the Pope, who is, very ill right now, is not, you can't call him a progressive, but at the same time, he's more progressive, specifically on the environment and also perhaps on certain socioeconomic issues than other parts of the Catholic hierarchy. So there has been a real sort of schism within the Catholic Church. And even within that, there's an additional schism where you have a lot of the Catholic hierarchy that has been completely discredited because of the Catholic Church's complicity in these horrible child abuse scandals and sex abuse scandals. So the Catholic hierarchy has actually lost a lot of credibility with the laity. But, within, like power hates a vacuum. At the same time, you have this sector of ultra-conservative Catholic laity that has kind of stepped up to fill in the gap, and they're funding things like Eternal EWTN. It's like ultra-conservative. It's like been described as like the Fox News of the Catholic world. You have them funding groups like Legatus or Compact or other. I'm sorry, not Compact. Is I can't remember the name of that organization. Or
okay,
a whole,
but there are a lot of conservative Catholic outlets that are pushing for their viewpoint too. And I am worried that when the current Pope dies, which could be very soon, it's only going to make an already conservative church even more conservative.
There is definitely a war within the church where there's a more, I would say, more progressive element. And then, of course, an ultra-conservative element as well. And a lot of the very wealthy Catholic laity are pushing to sort of drag the church to the right and fuse it with a kind of pro-capitalist ideology.
This is hyper-specific, but Trump recently came out with an executive order to form an anti-Christian bias task force, going back to that idea that conservative Christians are really the ones being persecuted. Is that, I mean, we can laugh about that and be like, there's really no anti-Christian bias, certainly not in the government. I actually went through his executive order, and the literal examples he gives of that bias are steeped in lies and misinformation. But is
like, I'm really curious. Give me an example.
Oh my God. I mean, some of the stuff they said, the most famous example, the most eye-popping example was that the FBI was targeting a conservative Catholic and linking that person to like a terrorist organization. But when you looked at what the FBI people actually did, they were like, this dude's on our radar. He's said some horrible things online. He's gotten weapons. We believe he's going to act on this. Oh, and by the way, he joined this church that claims to be very conservative Catholic. They're actually not even affiliated with the Catholic Church because they don't believe in the current Pope's legitimacy and whatnot. However, we just want to know if that church is something he's using as a recruiting tool, things like that. When the FBI agents spoke to the leaders of that church, they're all like, are you here to talk about like Bob? Because he freaks us out.
Oh, so, that's like, really interesting.
Yeah, they were like, this dude's kind of bad and he's creeping us out. And the thing is, that was one guy. They actually found a couple other people separate from that guy who were attending similar churches. And the analyst basically said, look, this is maybe something we want to look out for, because this may be a recruiting space that these types of people are using. And when a version of that report was sent to like superiors, someone leaked it. And of course, Republican politicians are like, they're going after conservative Catholics. Look, in the document, it says they like a Latin mass. And so clearly they're just going after. This is an example that Trump mentioned of
this guy
anti-Christian bias.
For like a terrorist act, for a
But
domestic act.
But the point I'm trying to make, of course, is they weren't going after Catholics. They weren't even going after conservative Catholics. I am wondering, when it comes to executive orders like the Anti-Christian Bias Task Force, part of me thinks that this thing will form, he'll get the headlines he wants out of it, and at the end of the day, they will just say, hey, guess what? We could say Merry Christmas in the government now, so we solve the problems and that's it, and it's purely symbolic and nothing actually happens. But is there any fear that these types of executive orders can actually do more damage, or is it just window dressing and symbolism just to get people off of his case with, we'll feed you a little something to keep you occupied?
That we can't discount this. I mean, look at one of the first things that Trump did when he was elected is actually pardoning the January 6th coup attempters, domestic terrorists who stormed the Capitol and assaulted police officers. And he did this as a way of saying, hey, and some of them, are members of these groups like Proud Boys, which didn't start off as a religious group, but sort of adopted a more Christian nationalist rhetoric over time as they realized that it was sort of how much power the movement had and how it could sort of help them in their in their organization. So, and then he also pardoned a number of anti-abortion activists who had violently opposed, not just, standing outside of clinics and shouting, but like used physical objects to bar people from entering and stop them from getting health care, and then actually resulting in personal injury to at least one.
That was actually another literal example he gave as anti-Christian bias, that those people who are harassing clinic workers and people entering that abortion clinic, he said, well, they arrested an old woman who was just trying to peacefully pray and protest or whatever. It's like, that's not what they were doing at all.
These people repeatedly violated the law. They're lawbreakers. So they weren't operating, as anti-abortion protesters within the law. They were doing stuff that is legally unlawful, that was unlawful. And he's basically saying, hey, if you are of the right religion and you're on my side and you're working for me, I will reward you. It's a way of trying to create a kind of like a brown shirts or something like that, a kind of people who will operate outside the law on his behalf. So
since we're talking about abortion, Trump recently said he wants to expand in vitro fertilization. He issued maybe it's another executive order, but he said, I'm going to put together a committee to give me recommendations, which is always what presidents say when they don't actually want to do anything, but they want to pretend like they are. I am curious if that sort of thing that he thinks is good politics is actually going to alienate some of his staunch anti-abortion allies, even though it's purely symbolic and won't lead to anything. It's like, maybe there's hope.
Well, it's really interesting. It's not in vitro fertilization itself that they don't like. It's the fact that some of the, whatever diploid zygotes that are created through in vitro or fetuses are discarded after. So they see it as setting up the conditions for what they think is baby murder, because like through in vitro, people often create a lot of embryos.
A lot of embryos that they might have to discard down the line.
Right. So they think that discarding is the problematic. But it's like Trump knows you can't take what he says with any thinking there's any sincerity into it. He's playing politics. I remember he was speaking at one of the big conferences last summer, and he was speaking about abortion to a group of true believers. And he was saying, look, first we got to win elections and it's all good. Because I think people were concerned with, you just said it's going to go to the states. Is that enough? And he was like, listen, first we're going to win elections and it's all going to work out in the end. So he's basically saying, you guys are going to get everything what you want, which is a total ban on abortion nationwide. But I got to win an election and I can't do it if I, campaign on a policy that is, by the way, not popular even among most Republicans.
Right.
I mean, most Americans, Republican and Democrat alike, support abortion, reproductive rights and abortion rights, at least in some form. So, but the folks who are sort of behind that anti-abortion movement are extreme. I mean, they talk about they believe that certain forms of birth control that prohibit implantation count as abortion. So it's very, I don't know to say, it goes against any definition of what pregnancy is. But, I think the rule
Turns out
is,
when you get rid of all the scientists, you're going to get some very bad information.
this is absolutely true. But, I think that I've attended gatherings where a number of them have said, we need to bring consequences back into sex and eliminate recreational sex.
Right.
So this is for them a great tool for that. Eliminate the most popular and effective forms of birth control, and all of a sudden, you're controlling people's their lives in their bedrooms.